My name's Thor, and you're listening to Cage Radio. Khabib Nurmagomedov is known today as the once and future king of mixed martial arts. His smothering, oppressive, high-pressure grappling style, now coined as chain wrestling, led him to a 29-0 record in MMA, many of which were matches against incredibly talented fighters like Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, Ally Quinta, Rafael dos Anjos, and Conor McGregor. Watching him smash his way through the who's who of lightweight favorites was as unbelievable as it was dominant. Khabib did not possess any superhuman attributes physically. He was not blindingly fast, nor liquid smooth, nor did he seem to have any kind of supernatural strength. His gas tank certainly was good, especially for such an incredible wrestler, but it is to be expected. However, it was his godlike knowledge of the techniques he was using that made his opposition absolute. Dozens of takedowns, counters, transitions, and strikes trained and retrained, drilled into his mind and body during hundreds of hours of practice since he was a child. But a child does not do this by themselves. I've heard it said that the earth is our mother. She builds, raises, and nurtures our body and heart. The Father, then, is the sky, the source of our heat, spirit, and direction, he that we look to for inspiration and knowledge. Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov was Khabib's father. When I say that he was a great man, I mean it in the most sincere way I can muster. He was not rich or glamorous or extremely famous. What he had was principle and discipline, both of which were unwavering in their application. From the time Khabib was very young, Abdulmanap thrust Khabib into the fires of training and competition, treating him no different than any other fighter at his nationally renowned Russian gym. This man was himself a member of the Russian armed forces and a champion of combat sambo and judo, a genius-level trainer who produced multitudes of champions throughout his life, regardless of familial relationship. Khabib's father often entered his son into competition against opponents who were far better, higher level, and had more accolades. The experiences against these seasoned fighters was humiliating for the young eagle, destroying his ego, even reducing him to tears. Khabib often asked his father why he was forced to fight such monsters. But his father knew that to forge a sword, you must expose raw metal to an inferno, splitting it and hammering it into shape, refining it with layers of heat and pressure over and over again, folding and striking the blade to perfection. And so he did, creating a fighter that would conquer the West and inspire the world. My impression of Khabib and his father was not that their relationship was special because of the love between them paternally, though I'm sure that was there, but because of the respect and complete admiration a great man would have for the one who made him. Khabib's father, in the strictest sense, was probably the greatest father to ever walk the face of the planet. Our story is not about men like him. Once upon a time, my father was a pretty good dad. It's hard to admit this now, sitting here writing this, as he has done so much damage to my heart and family. But there was a time when I looked forward to nothing more than to see my father come home from work every day. We would watch Dragon Ball Z together, talk about comics, how to get a girlfriend, and he would tell us about the nature of reality. He knew things we couldn't imagine. I once asked him what the universe was made of. He said atoms and molecules. Like any impertinent 7-year-old, I asked what those were made of. He insisted that below that was purely energy-based structures. I had no idea what that could have been possibly meant. Fast forward 20 years, and I have learned about string theory, quantum foam, and the theoretical structure of gravity, and even the idea that our universe might be a simulation. I don't know if he knew any of that stuff, but if he did, he didn't burden a 7-year-old with it. My dad also liked drugs and sex with strange women, a predilection that would ultimately destroy us all. He tolerated my mother at best. I can't blame him. My mom could be a chore even on a good day. She was a person who would go out of her way to create problems where there need be none, simply out of boredom. Eventually, my brother and I reached our teenage years, and if I'm completely honest with myself, I was a shitty kid to deal with. I remember calling my father a bastard one day, offhandedly. My grandmother was there to hear it, and it shocked her. For years, I have blamed him for leaving us. But as I sit here now reflecting, I have to wonder if it was I who was at least partly to blame. Being a father is hard, not just because of the responsibility, but because of the life that all boys leave behind when they wish to fully evolve into a man with the legacy known as family. Before my father endeavored down that path, he loved to party. My mother and father were both addicts of one sort or another before they met, and even after conceiving, my father remained a stoner during the 90s, before the California state government decided it was not the worst thing in the world after all. Fast forward 15 years, and I too am in love with marijuana for a time that stretches on for far too long. Almost a full decade of smoking every single day, even going so far as to visit that one guy, Dave, who I don't really like, but has really amazing weed and shares it freely. As I write this now, I recognize that marijuana had prevented many opportunities from coming my way, mainly by keeping me firmly locked to my couch, stuffing potato chips in my mouth while I played hours of mindless video games. But that's nothing compared to the pit of narcotics that my father would march into. I don't precisely know how he got his hands on the harder stuff. Maybe he always knew someone. If I recall correctly, there was a shady man named Barry who lived in a dilapidated house just down the road. They spent a lot of time together. He seemed like the type. My father would vanish into that pit, never to be a significant figure in our lives ever again. I would hear things about him from time to time, mainly about the string of misfortunes that seemed to follow him everywhere. The one significant interaction I had with him was right amidst my amateur fighting stint. I was staying with my grandfather for a few days. My father, the ghost of his former self, showed up. He looked drained and was missing his glasses, as well as a few of his front teeth. He seemed half asleep and not overly excited to see me. The feeling felt more like he had run into an old coworker that he was just sort of okay with. I watched as he helped himself to the fridge and all of its contents. We sat at a small, round kitchen table, and I studied him as he ate a few slices of pizza from Papa Murphy's that my grandpa had ordered. I think the only reason that he sat with me was because he felt obligated to. I told him about MMA, and how I had just had my first fight against someone who crushed me, but that we were now training together. I went on to talk about my love life and my mother, who had passed away only a few years before. The conversation took a turn towards the awkward when my father brought up his new girlfriend and her son, a boy named Alex, who had apparently set my father's truck on fire and broken his nose. He asked if I could use my fighting skills to straighten the boy out. I asked him why Alex had done that. My dad said, "No reason." As I watched this drug-addicted shell of a human wane in and out of attention with the conversation, I could only imagine a few reasons to break his nose and set his things on fire. I didn't know the man before me anymore. He was a stranger. In 15 years since then, I've only met him 2 other times and spoken to him on the phone once to tell him about his granddaughter. It hardly seemed to matter to him. He was more zombie than human by then. I miss the old dad. There are some, however, whose paternal relationship was far less benign than mine was. The low-hanging fruit for this video would be to speak about Sean Strickland, the current UFC middleweight champion who is famous for his outspoken conservative views and his outrageously tragic childhood at the hands of an abusive father. I didn't know much about Strickland before he defeated the Hokage of cringe, Israel Adesanya, in a one-sided destruction where Strickland would prove to the world just how proficient he was in the dimension of striking. After absorbing his various sound bites in search of his comedically unhinged comments about the vast congress of life, I noted his chagrin for his father. His dad was apparently a pretty awful person. Drug addiction, abuse, sexual misconduct towards Sean's mom, death threats, beatings, and just a general mean disposition. That is the stereotypical bad father. A tyrant who bullies, a savage who reaps, a monster who feasts on the sorrow of those closest to him. It's at least worth a mention. There are dozens of Strickland stories about how his father was beating his mom for various pathetic reasons. I found a piece from the Joe Rogan Experience while researching this video, where Sean recalls sleeping in his mom's bed so that his dad wouldn't kill her. In another instance, Sean is hiding under the bed while his father chokes his mother during sex, whispering to her that tonight she was going to die. In terror, Sean clubs his father over the head with a guitar and runs off to call the police. Sean would have to watch his mother bail the man out, an incident that I'm sure led to a severe amount of trouble for Sean. When Sean got old enough to fight back, he would find himself in a final confrontation with his father, where Sean would deliver a devastating headbutt to the man who tormented his entire childhood. Sean lamented that it was disappointing to see the predator crumple so easily before him. I imagine that kind of build-up over time, the level of animosity rising in the boy until he finally had the body of a man and was ready for the showdown, like the final boss of some episodic cartoon. Deflating to know this bully of a father was always pathetic and only picked on the weak to hide his inferiority. Years later, Sean would encourage his father to commit suicide after he'd lost everything: his wife, his job, his health, even the fear from his family that seemed to sustain his glass ego. "Just do it," Sean said. 5 years later, as Sean's father lay dying from cancer at the age of 50, he would admit to Sean that he knew he wasn't a good father, him as he should have been, but that at the very least, he never molested him. As a dad, that's how you raise the bar. A bar that Mark Hunt's father would never hurdle. Mark Hunt is a unique heavyweight figure. During his stint in Pride, I thought of him as large compared to many of his opponents. But as I grew up, I swelled in size to 6'4", and often thought of him as small, especially for a Samoan. But in the greater pool of elite MMA fighters and kickboxers, I didn't see what made him so good. But as I watched him more growing up, I saw his innate ability to shrug off strikes against him that would shatter most men. And what's more, he seemed to know precisely how to put people into sleep mode with his hands. His casual demeanor as he left his opponents lifeless on the canvas, commonly known as the walk-off KO, was his signature. I always got the impression that to him, fighting was a chore. Like he grudgingly marched out of the ring after each fight and demanded his money, and then left. Fanfare be damned. I would later learn that, no, he loved fighting. He was just pretty chill about it. I have several Polynesian friends that I play Dungeons & Dragons with, each of whom are in some way connected to the Mormon Church. I'm not here to get preachy or critical of religion. I myself have faith in one thing or another, and it's a personal matter that only needs to make sense to me. But according to Mark Hunt, his father used the church in some way to hide the abuse he would impart on his children. I did not understand what this meant, and I ultimately had to purchase his autobiography to uncover the truth. Reading that book filled me with hatred for Mark's parents. My own parents battered and abandoned me, but I could not really say I felt hate. Mostly just longing and pity. The things in that book are almost unspeakable, so much so that when the biographer tried interviewing Mark for his story, it took Mark literal, actual months to open up about it. Before I continue telling this brief synopsis of Mark Hunt's early life, I want to say that I really love writing. With my last video, I found it easy to blast through the backstory breakdowns fairly quickly. The writing seemed to flow out as I focused my fingers and knowledge into creating something that I thought would be compelling. Admittedly, I used some cheats to sew these things together, like copy-pasting from Wikipedia to gather as much matter-of-fact information as possible. Wikipedia is pretty good for that. Sometimes I'll read a couple headlines, grab a couple good facts, and scurry off into the writing lab to hoard my words like a rat collecting scraps of cheese. But when I came across Mark's story, I was confused by what I was hearing, seeing, and reading. I watched an interview early to try to gain clarity, and normally, I do not want to do this. It takes so much time away from getting the production to the final cut. But even in the interview with Mark, the facts behind what was going on in the Hunt house were elusive. The horror he alluded to scrambled my mind. Luckily, or perhaps in a calculated marketing ploy, the Super Samoan was somewhat cagey in elaborating on the aspects of the story during the interview, but was holding a copy of his biography that he had just published. The interview briefly mentioned that Mark had been involved with gang life from an extremely early age, which was the first shock to my system. Mark had always seemed to me as a mild-mannered person, a good and decent man, a blue-collar type of guy like Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonner, the kind of guy I could have a beer with. Surely this wasn't like a real gang, right? I quickly ordered a copy of the book on Kindle and began poring over the contents. listeners. Listeners. How do I start this horror story? In 2005, an Australian movie named Wolf Creek came out to the general public. In the film, a couple of backpackers are lured into the jaws of a sadistic serial killer named Mick Taylor. Mick would murder, rape, torture, torment, hunt, and feed the travelers to several vicious dogs during the course of the film. The movie is bleak and does not leave one rooting for the killer in the same way that Friday the 13th or Predator did. There is a realism to the film that makes the experience feel like you are there during the ordeal, trying to escape it in any way that you can, but unable to because you don't want to leave the remaining survivors behind. When Mark Hunt saw the movie, he remarked that Mick Taylor reminded him of his father. Mark grew up in a family of 6. Mark, his brothers John and Steve, his sister Victoria, with Melioda, the mom, and Charles Sale Hunt, the father. Growing up in that house must have felt like Wolf Creek, wanting to escape, but not wishing to abandon those behind you. Mark was the youngest, and in some ways probably the most dense to the truth of how bad the family's plight was. Mark grew up without any friends in the neighborhood. Mark's father, Charles Sale, had a tremendously negative reputation among the neighbors for reasons that, even in the book, are scant. Hunt's mom is described as being, quote, loud, while Hunt's father was described as being very physical. That's it. I can only imagine more than that. However, it would not surprise me to learn that Charles had beaten up a few of the neighbors. He certainly beat his kids, and by beat, I mean he would knock them around like a mafia collection thug. Mark's dad likely served him more knuckle sandwiches than pieces of bread before he was the age of 10. Mark also recalled the many hours he spent kneeling on hardwood floor with the rest of his siblings, staring out the window at a peach tree growing in the courtyard outside. Sometimes, Charles would force his kids to sit under a tree while he chopped it down. If the kids ran, he would beat them till their legs no longer worked properly and their eyes were too swollen to see. Except Victoria, his sister. Mark remarked that his sister never got the same kind of beatings. Instead, his father would spend a lot of time in the bedroom with her, alone. When the boys would ask their mom, Melioda, what was happening in there, she would kick them out of the house for a few hours. Melioda knew exactly what was happening and covered for Charles. In fact, everyone, except for Mark, knew what was happening. Apparently, Victoria had been a victim of this activity her whole life, regardless of whether it was her father or uncles around, regardless of whether they were staying in New Zealand or Samoa. The very not nice R word that all women hate would find her. Rumors followed her relentlessly. At school, people began to say that she was pregnant from Charles. What could be said? It might have been the truth, but because of the constant beatings, no fetus could survive in the womb. The family was Mormon, and at some point Victoria would ask the bishop to intervene in the very, very not niceness that Charles was bringing her on these bedroom visits. They didn't. Instead, the church seemed to cover for Charles. Independent of anything said in the book, I wondered if Charles was a fixer or a thug for the church in the area. That would be something to explain a lot about the family. But there is no evidence of that, other than that the church would spend a lot of time at the house after Victoria begged them for help. When the church came, Charles and Melioda would reveal food for them, serving them handsomely. In contrast, the Hunt kids were literally playing the Hunger Games most nights. Mark says that the most overwhelming sensation from that time period was not the crack of knuckles across his face, but the feeling of starvation from being powerless to acquire food unless he stole it, which he often did. I've read that there are several key factors in creating a sociopath. That is to say, a person who conducts himself without considering the feelings or consequences of or towards others. One of these factors is to have a significantly traumatizing childhood. Being starved, beaten, secluded from the community, forced to compete with his siblings for food, and having to experience his father being non-consensual with his sister, with approval even from his mother. It turned Hunt into a terror as a young man. Mark thought nothing of stealing cars, strong-armed robbery towards people on the street, beating up rival kids with his superior size and strength, robbing businesses, shoplifting, all of which he did with several accomplices for years and years, incurring dozens of arrests, only to be set free near immediately to do it all again. You know, gang stuff. One night, when Hunt was 18, after robbing a rival gang of their own stolen goods, the crew would jump Mark outside of a club that belonged to a kickboxer named Sam Marsters. The cops arrived quickly and started grabbing people. Marsters noticed that Hunt had a natural talent for violence and saw an opportunity. 5 days later, after a short stint on hitting pads, training, and just generally getting an idea for how to fight others in a more technical sense, Hunt would compete in his first fight that didn't take place in the street or in his house against his father. The rest, as they say, is history. Hunt would rise as one of the greatest kickboxers and mixed martial artists ever, and conversely, his father would wither away into a swollen mass of yellow flesh and stringy gray hair. After everything, it was Mark who would identify Charles Sale's body in the morgue. In all the ways that Sean Strickland's father was a bastard, Hunt's father was dozens of times worse. I'll have to wait for Sean's biography to come out to confirm for sure, but from everything I've read and heard, how could it be? It's fascinating how much depravity can come from the past of those in the business of violence. However, the tyrant is not the only archetype of poor father. Enter the abandoner. Boys need direction. Boys, most of all, need leaders to steer them in the right direction, away from the proclivities towards self-indulgence, stupidity, tribalism, and sexism. This direction usually needs to be given to them by their father. I, too, entered my teenage years without my father. And even if he had been there, what would he have done for me? That day I called him a bastard. He did nothing to make me pay for it. Did nothing to correct me. This was during the time when my father was already 1 foot out the door, on to his life, parties, drugs, sex, and petty crime. Me calling him a bastard was nothing to him. By then, I was becoming nothing to him. My dad had resolved to give up trying and let the family suffer the consequences of his forfeiture. I had a lot of anger growing up. I got mixed up with feelings of violence, revenge, training, guns, and power. I looked for fights despite me attempting to wrangle in those nice guy images. The feelings of overwhelming barbarism usually lurked beneath the surface, like a hungry gator at a waterhole flamed with wildebeest. I think this is what drew me into The Ultimate Fighter. Spike TV was a network that ran men's entertainment, really stupid things like Most Extreme Elimination Challenge, World's Wildest Police Videos, and 1,000 Ways to Die. Simpler, happier times indeed. I loved it. And I was delighted when Spike started showing The Ultimate Fighter. Its first reality TV show, and a huge hit for both the network and the UFC. Griffin and Bonner had the most important fight in the history of the sport during the finale, but during the actual bulk of the show itself, one cast member drew most of the attention, had the highest ratings, and was included as often as possible on screen. I loved this guy. I watched Chris Lee Ben. His dirty, brownish orange hair. This asshole from Portland, Oregon, would pee on a guy's bed, brag about all the strippers he had nailed, drink as much alcohol as he could, and generally acted like an annoying menace to the whole house. I was nothing really like him. At this time, I didn't drink. I didn't smoke. I wasn't into strippers, and I wasn't a menace to the people around me. I was still a junior in high school. My parents had already imploded like the Death Star, and I was wise to the mistakes they had made concerning their life choices thanks to a 12-step program and the efforts of my aunt. What was it about him then? What was it that drew me to him? I watched every episode intently. On one episode, my least liked fighter in the history of the sport, Mega Super Turd Josh Koscheck and his sidekick Bobby Southwark, called Chris a fatherless bastard. I wasn't sure if I already knew that his father was absent from his life, but in that moment, the effect that Southward's words had on Chris were as plain and painful as the burning desert sun of Las Vegas. Chris, in a drunken state, broke down into a sobbing heap, destroyed by the comment after days of proclaiming his greatness and confidence to the house. The alcohol, which typically shows the real insides of a person, revealed to the world the amount of pain that flooded Lee Ben. By this time, my own father was long gone. My fascination with Chris came into focus. I no longer saw him as the wild asshole, but as a lonely, wounded boy who ran amok in his own life, unchained by the absence of his father. Were it not for my aunt, the woman who ended up raising us, I might have taken the same path. My aunt was a remarkable person. I have often despised her, but upon writing this, reflecting on the place that fathers have in their kids' lives, I realize now that she was always there to impart me with that strength, that fortitude, that judgment. As hard as I would push against her, she would push back into me, forcing me into line and into doing things that I hated to make me better, stronger as a person. She didn't care if I hated her for it either. She wasn't about to take my shit, like a good father or strong mother would. She had the unfortunate task of being both. Everything good that I am today came because of that pressure from her. I should probably hang out with her more. She knows how to build character, and now that I'm a true man, I like that. However, it seems to me that you can have all the qualities of a good father: strength of character, leadership, caring for one's family, love, and dedication, and still be a shitty father. Enter the bad example. If you are reading this now and you don't know who Leon Rocky Edwards is, then you clearly aren't current with MMA rankings and tidings. It's okay. There was seriously a 10-year period where I legitimately thought that Ken Shamrock was literally the world's most dangerous man. And who the fuck is John Jones anyway? Regardless of whatever temporal trap you're in, the fact is that Leon Edwards is currently the welterweight champion of the world. If you followed his UFC career, which realistically no one did, Leon was essentially an afterthought for most of his time in the octagon. Despite building an emphatically impressive record, including having a 10-fight win streak after losing to Kamaru Usman the first time. In spite of this tear, people essentially forgot he existed. Maybe it was his English accent, or his soft face, or his slender frame, or the 3-piece and soda that he was delivered by Jorge Masvidal. Any of these things, all of these things, together, perhaps, left no impression other than to be forgettable. Something about the look and feel of that man did nothing to impress others. It took him years of grinding away to finally get his second shot at Kamaru Usman. And when he got it, he made good on his opportunity, executing a perfect head kick to snatch victory and the belt. That night, Leon Edwards became undeniable, a hard-luck talent that fought his way up from the rankings purgatory to become champion. I used to think that this was why they called him Rocky. I was wrong. Leon was born in Jamaica and raised in the city of Kingston. I scoured the internet for Leon's dad's name. None of the news article had it, but of course, Reddit did. Rufus Edwards was a notorious gang leader, human trafficker, and drug dealer. I suspect that Rufus did many other things during his time in Kingston, mainly because of the reputation held by the city. To be a gang leader in Kingston is like being a tiger in a den of wolves. Everyone in there is dangerous, but you are just a little better at it. Eventually, Rufus moved his family to Birmingham, England, supposedly for a better life, but very little changed. Rufus remained much the same, carrying on in the gang life as if he were still in Kingston, but now with an even funnier accent. Eventually, Rufus would be gunned down in a nightclub over the sale of a brick of low-quality cocaine. Even tigers can die to gunfire. Rufus's legacy was very nearly that of a son who followed way too close in his footsteps. Leon would find himself arrested for a variety of gang-related activity, including drug dealing, street fighting, knife possession, along with all the others in his social circle. It's obvious to me now, looking at Colby Covington's statement about sending Leon to hell to meet his father. When Leon threw the bottle, it was thrown out of love and respect for his dad. In spite of all the evil that his father had imparted on his slice of the world, Leon, his son, still carried that cross near into his heart, the old man. Thankfully, Leon's mother, who had always been a hard worker, was there, much like my aunt, to set an example of the other side of the coin. When Leon entered the local MMA gym, he found that he had a knack for it, and obviously, it stuck. And now, here we are. Leon Rocky Edwards, welterweight champion. Not bad, Rock. I usually take all the things I talk about in my video and relate it back to my life in some way. But these guys went through something that I never did. My father never tried to kill my mom. He never beat me. And while he did abandon us, he at least had the decency to spend most of my childhood around doing all the dad things that a kid could really want. And then, when he tapped out on fatherhood, left us out of the nightmare of his hardcore drug addiction. It's not respectable. It's not preferable. It's not decent. It's not honorable. It just is what it is. And while it hurts, I accept the pain. It makes me who I am. His absence gives me purpose, decency, willpower, and the foreboding to do the right thing by the people I'm responsible for. From his failure, I rise to success, and I'm sure my daughter appreciates it. Speaking of which, I need to end this video here. I know a little girl that needs a diaper change, a bottle of milk, and a wife who needs a little break. Duty calls. My name's Thor, and this has been a special Cage Radio production.